Hello everyone, this is Yanis Makula and thank you for stopping by. Today we're celebrating Stamptember. This is a month-long event from Simon Says Stamp dedicated to stamping. And this video is also a part of a Stamptember blog hop that is filled with lots of prizes and amazing inspiration. Be sure to go over to my blog to join the hop and enter giveaways. The link to my blog can be found below. I'm going to share a simple Christmas card using a few new Stamptember products, and the stamp set I got most excited about is this stunning sentiment that reads Merry Christmas. The calligraphy here is exquisite and absolutely perfect for Christmas cards. I really like how big this sentiment is. It's large enough to be the focal point of a card, and therefore is ideal for creating multiple quick Christmas projects. I'm going to use this sentiment and I'll heat emboss it onto watercolor paper, and I'll add a red watercolor wash to the background. Here I have my mini Misty stamp positioner and a panel of watercolor paper, and I'm going to place my stamp onto my paper. We'll close the Misty door and we'll mount the stamp onto the Misty. I want to do heat embossing, so I'm using my anti-static powder tool to prep the surface of my paper for embossing. Now what this does is it simply helps to keep embossing nice and clean, and using a tool like this or a similar tool really makes all the difference. I'm using my Versamark Watermark ink pad. This is a clear embossing ink. I'm going to ink up my stamp. We'll close the Misty door and we'll stamp this image onto my paper. The reason I'm using Misty is because I want to heat emboss the sentiment a few times for a really nice and raised effect. I'm going to use Simon Says Stamp Antique Gold Embossing Powder, and I'm going to cover my paper with this powder. Now, because this is watercolor paper, there is a little bit of texture there, so the image did not stamp perfectly, and I have a few gaps on there, but I'll eliminate those when I'll go to do the second layer of heat embossing. And I'm also using a dry paintbrush to swipe away any additional embossing powder particles, and going to preheat my heat tool and we'll melt the powder. If I were to stamp this onto regular paper, regular smooth, non-textured cardstock, I wouldn't have had these imperfections. But since I wanted to do that watercolor wash, I went with watercolor paper, and this is why the image did not stamp perfectly onto my paper. I'm going to put this back into my Misty, ink up my stamp again, and add another layer of embossing powder over the top. To get a better impression, you can try to use smooth watercolor paper. However, I only had textured paper on hand, so this is why I used that. Once again, I used a dry brush to remove any stray embossing powder particles and melted the powder with my heat tool. Now, I still had a few non-embossed sections on my paper, so I went in with my Versamarker. This is embossing ink in a pen. So the same embossing ink I used to ink my stamp with, but it's just in the form of a pen or a marker. And I'm using it to add embossing ink directly to the sections where it didn't emboss well. Next, I'm adding embossing powder, and once again heat embossing this for the third time. So this time I did not add embossing powder to every section of the sentiment. I only added it to the fat parts of the letters, so you can see how really nicely all that embossing powder melted into the previous layers and created one continuous heat embossed sentiment. Before I move on to adding a watercolor wash, I want to add some subtle detail to my background, and for that I'm using a new Dots and Hearts background stamp and same Versamark embossing ink. Now, I discovered this trick or this technique completely by accident. When you stamp with Versamark ink onto a dark colored paper, you get a tone-on-tone look or a watermark effect. And when you stamp with the same Versamark ink onto white paper, you can't really see anything. But when you add watercolor over it, it does react and create a subtle pattern. And I don't think there's anything else out there that you can use to achieve this look, but I could be wrong though. So I inked up the background stamp with Versamark ink. This stamp set, by the way, is also a new Stamptember product. I placed my paper over the stamp and used a brayer to apply even pressure and transfer the ink onto the paper. So I'm not doing any additional heat embossing. I'm only adding stamping to the background using clear ink. Before I move on to watercoloring, I want to stamp one more image, an adorable little bear from the Christmas Toys stamp set, and also a Santa hat to dress him up from the Christmas Cats stamp set. And all of these stamp sets are from Simon Says Stamp. I'm using Onyx Black ink to stamp those and stamping them onto same watercolor paper. I'm going to use distress inks to color my images and to create a watercolor wash on my background panel. To color the bear, I'm using tea dye and gathered twigs, and I have a piece of acetate on my desk, and I'm going to press the ink pads onto the acetate to get some ink out. I'm using a medium water brush to pick up the ink and color my images. Now, I'm not doing any fancy watercoloring. I'm simply adding color here and making sure to leave some sections white so that my watercoloring appears messy. And I'm really into this look lately, and I love how easy it is to achieve it too. To color the Santa's hat, I'm using the same approach and Festive Berries Distress ink. Now let's move on to the heat embossed panel. I've added some more Festive Berries ink onto my acetate sheet. I have some water and a flat 1/2 inch paintbrush. I'm going to wet my brush, pick up some of that ink, and begin to apply it onto my panel in quick horizontal swipes. And as soon as this ink hits the surface of the paper, you can see the stamped dots and hearts background begin to somewhat resist it. It's not the kind of resist you get with heat embossing, but this is definitely a fun effect. You can also do this with traditional watercolors, but because they are more pigmented, you'll have less of this faux resist showing on your background unless you water down your watercolors significantly. And I'll show you an identical card with traditional watercolors at the end of this video. I'm going to set my panel aside for now to let it air dry, and we'll use matching dies to cut my stamped images out. I lost my Santa's hat die some time ago, so I'm cutting it out by hand, but I did die cut the little toy bear. I'm using my Sakura Quickie glue pen to adhere the Santa's hat onto the bear, and I'm going to add a generous coat of stickles over the white areas of the hat to add a little bit of glitter to my card. By the time I finished that, my background was pretty much dry, so I went back to my distress inks and added some candied apple ink onto my acetate sheet. I re-wet my paintbrush and applied a second layer of watercolor. I did not cover the entire background. I only added loose watercolor stripes, and I held my paintbrush like usual and also sideways to create narrow stripes. Because I got some ink onto my heat embossed sediment, I came in with my crafty rag and cleaned up my heat embossing by wiping that embossed area. After my background was dry, I used a rectangle die from Simon and trimmed it down just a little bit. My desk was a mess when I was filming this video, and my die cutting machine was sitting on the floor, so this is why I'm not showing you the die cutting process here. Because I did quite a bit of heat embossing and added some water to this piece, my paper warped slightly. To flatten it out, I used a layer of fun foam, and I picked one in red. I trimmed it down so it was just a little bit smaller than my watercolor paper, and I learned this tip from Jennifer McGuire, by the way, and I added a layer of double-sided adhesive. I used this to foam mount my panel onto my card base and also to flatten this layer just a little bit. I used Schoolhouse Red cardstock from Simon Says Stamp to create a card base for this project, and I also wrapped some natural twine around my panel and tied it into a bow. I still had that adorable little bear, so I foam mounted him onto the card as well. Lastly, I had to add just a few clear droplets, and these are droplets in 4mm and 6mm size, and they are from Pretty Pink Posh. I added a few here and there, and I used my Sakura Quickie glue pen to adhere them in place. Before I go, I wanted to show you another card I created using same supplies, but with slight variations. So this one was foam mounted onto a white card base, and instead of using distress inks, I used my Gansai Tambi watercolors, and you can see that Versamark stamping is a bit less visible there, but it still shows. And here's a test piece that I did where I actually heat embossed the dots and hearts in white embossing powder before adding that watercolor wash. And this is actually where I got the idea to just stamp the background with Versamark ink and skip embossing. So this finishes my today's video. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to head over to my blog to join Simon Says Stamp Stamptember blog hub and get inspired. If you'd like to see a list of supplies I used to create my card, I have it in my video description and also on my blog. You're seeing some additional videos from my channel featuring holiday cards. Be sure to check those out as well. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye!